The northern rapids roared through the gorge, a relentless churn of black water and white foam that smelled of crushed pine and freezing ozone. Clara knelt on the jagged shale of the riverbank, her fingers moving with the precise, mechanical efficiency of a woman who no longer had the luxury of panic. The bitter wind bit into her exposed skin, but she did not shiver. Shivering wasted energy. She had exactly 20 minutes before Regina Thorne's trackers reached this bend in the river, and the scene had to be flawless. She took the hunting knife, stolen from the keep's kitchens, and pressed the blade against the fleshy part of her own forearm. A sharp intake of breath was her only concession to the pain. Blood welled immediately, thick and dark in the moonlight. She smeared it across the sharpest stones at the edge of the embankment, letting a few heavy drops splatter onto the frozen moss. It had to look like a desperate, heavily pregnant Omega had lost her footing while fighting off a feral rogue wolf. Regina had orchestrated the assassination plot with typical arrogance. The stepmother had assumed her target would simply cower in the royal chambers, waiting for the poisoned tea or the midnight blade that would ensure the unborn heir never drew breath. She had underestimated the particular kind of clarity that came with realizing no one was coming to save you. Clara unlaced her heavy boots, stepping onto the freezing mud in her woolen socks. She needed to leave a chaotic trail leading directly to the edge of the drop. Before she took the first step, she felt a sharp prick against her heel. Calmly, she sat back on a dry rock, rolled down the wet wool, and pulled a barbed burr from the fabric. A limp would slow her down by miles a day, and the terrain ahead was unforgiving. Survival was not about dramatic leaps. It was about avoiding infected blisters and twisted ankles in the dark. Once her foot was cleared, she pressed her weight into the mud, dragging her left heel to mimic a frantic scramble. At the very edge of the precipice, she discarded her bloody linen dress. She arranged the torn fabric carefully, catching the hem on a jagged root so it hung suspended over the boiling rapids. The river would take the blame for washing the body away. She redressed in the rough spun trousers and heavy coat she had stashed in a hollowed log days prior. Turning her back on the territory that had been her prison, the runaway mother walked into the freezing tree line without looking back. The cold logic of survival settled into her chest, and she had a long way to go before dawn. A week later, the pristine, pine-scented air of the Pack lands had been entirely replaced by the choking sulphur of Blackport. The human industrial city was a labyrinth of brick chimneys, soot-stained cobblestones, and the relentless pounding of ironworks. To a wolf's nose, it was sensory agony. To Clara, it was a fortress. The air was so thick with coal dust and burning slag that not even the Alpha King's elite trackers could trace a scent through the first city gate. She sat perfectly still in the cramped, gaslit office of the municipal registry. The room smelled of stale tobacco, damp wool, and the heavy leather bindings of official ledgers. Across the scarred wooden desk sat Julian Mercer, a human lawyer whose pragmatism was evident in the ink stains on his cuffs. He did not care about Pack politics or royal bloodlines. He cared about forms, stamps, and proper civic filing. The young woman slid the forged registry papers across the desk. They were beautifully crafted, purchased with the last of her dowry silver from a border smuggler. The documents listed her under her mother's human maiden name, Vance. A quiet widow seeking work, nothing more. Julian adjusted his spectacles, his pen hovering over the thick ledger book. He examined the wax seal, then glanced up at his client's exhausted face and the slight swell of her stomach hidden beneath the heavy coat. "Your husband, Mrs." "Vance," the lawyer began, his voice a dry rasp that matched the industrial grinding outside the window. "The registry requires a specific cause of death for the transfer of the residential permit." Clara did not hesitate. She had practiced the lie in the dark until it felt like a genuine memory. "A cave-in at the anthracite mines in Oakhaven," she said softly, lowering her gaze to stare at her own cracked knuckles. She had spent enough of her life learning not to cry in front of people who would not understand why. The support beams rotted through. He was on the lower extraction level. They didn't dig him out. Julian paused, his eyes drifted downward, catching sight of her heavy leather boots. The footwear was deeply scuffed, the creases packed with a thick layer of fine, black coal soot she had deliberately walked through near the rail yards. It was the undeniable dirt of the deep mining districts. The clerk nodded slowly, the professional skepticism leaving his posture. The physical evidence grounded her story in a harsh reality he understood perfectly. Men died in the dark every day here. A pregnant widow arriving with nothing but a battered trunk and soot on her shoes was a common, unremarkable tragedy. "I am sorry for your loss," Julian murmured, dipping his metal pen into the brass inkwell. He pressed the nib to the heavy parchment, the scratching sound loud and definitive in the quiet room. "You are officially recorded as a resident of Blackport, Mrs. Vance." With those few strokes of a human pen, the hunted Omega of the Sovereign Court ceased to exist. In her place sat a poor, invisible widow, armed with a new name and the absolute determination to keep her child alive. The air inside the Blackport shipping office did not merely smell of coal. It tasted of it. A thick, metallic grit settled on the teeth with every breath, and the heavy thud of raw anthracite being dumped from rail cars into the holding bins shook the floorboards every quarter hour. Clara Vance stood perfectly still before the battered oak desk, letting the vibrations travel up through the soles of her worn boots. She did not cough, and she did not attempt to wipe the fine layer of soot that had already gathered on her collar. Bartholomew Gedge did not look like a man who cared about forged registry papers or delicate manners. He looked like a man who cared about numbers, tonnage, and the sheer physical effort required to keep the industrial heart of the city beating. He was a wide, gruff figure with hands stained permanently black, studying Clara with eyes that had seen too many desperate people looking for a wage. "The work is numbers, not poetry," Bartholomew said, his voice like grinding stones. "You track the carts, you weigh the incoming shipments, you log the outgoing ash. If the tally is short by so much as a pound, the deficit comes out of your pay." He reached across the desk and pulled the carriage ledger toward her. It was a massive leather-bound volume, the corners softened by years of rough handling. Clara stepped forward, her eyes scanning the columns. The pages were ruled in faded red ink, tracking tons of anthracite, barrels of industrial tar, and the precise daily wages of 50 soot-stained men. The handwriting of the previous clerk was frantic, disorganized, slipping outside the lines. She recognized the chaos of a mind overwhelmed by the relentless volume of the shipments. Bartholomew reached into his heavy canvas apron. Without warning, he tossed a greasy, unwashed lump of raw coal directly onto the open page of the carriage ledger. It struck the paper with a dull thwack, leaving a thick, oily smear of black dust and grease across the center of the week's inventory. He leaned back, crossing his arms. It was a deliberate, practical test of her temperament. He expected her to gasp, to complain about the ruined page, or to attempt to brush it away frantically, smudging the ink further into the parchment. Clara did none of those things. She did not let her breath catch. She simply looked at the coal, then at the smear. Moving with unhurried precision, she picked up the lump of anthracite with her bare fingers, ignoring the grease that coated her skin, and set it carefully on the edge of the desk. She reached for a dry linen rag hanging from the inkstand, pressed it flat over the smear to absorb the loose oil without spreading it, and lifted it away. Taking up the dip pen, she checked the nib. The stain was dark, but the lines of the ledger were still faintly visible beneath it. Clara began to write. She did not attempt to replicate the elegant, flowing script of the sovereign court she had been raised in. Instead, she forced her handwriting to become average, practical, and slightly blocky. The script of a human woman who had learned her letters in a busy parish school. She wrote directly over the grease stain, pressing the nib just hard enough to ensure the ink cut through the oil and settled securely into the fibers of the page. Bartholomew watched the steady, rhythmic movement of her hand. He looked at the ink-stained fingers, the soot on her dress, and the absolute absence of complaint in her posture. "You start at dawn," he grunted, pulling the carriage ledger back toward his side of the desk. "Pay is at the end of the week. Don't be late." Clara nodded once, wiping her blackened fingers on her apron. The heavy grit of the coal yard was not a punishment. It was a perfect, impenetrable layer of administrative camouflage. By nightfall, the relentless, mechanical noise of the yard gave way to the freezing, stagnant silence of the cramped attic apartment she had secured above a shuttered bakery. The ceiling sloped downward, pressing in on them, and the single window was coated in a permanent layer of grime that muted the moonlight into a dull, grey haze. The room was heated only by a narrow iron stove that burned leftover coal dust, but the shadows were entirely their own. Clara knelt on the scarred wooden floorboards beside a shallow tin basin. The water inside was lukewarm, steaming faintly in the frigid air. Beside the basin sat a dark glass bottle containing the abrasive masking fluid. It was a crude, chemically aggressive formula she had perfected over the first week. Raw pine tar cut with highly acidic white vinegar. It smelled sharp, caustic, and overwhelmingly industrial, designed to entirely mask the subtle, natural scent of pine and ozone that marked their royal wolf bloodlines. 6-year-old Pip stood bare-legged in the center of the basin, his small hands clutching the corrugated edges for balance. His face was smudged with the day's soot, his dark hair falling over eyes that were far too observant for a normal human child. "Arms up, Pip," Clara said softly, rolling up her own sleeves. He obeyed instantly, lifting his thin arms. Clara poured a small measure of the caustic concoction onto a coarse sponge. The smell immediately filled the tiny room, sharp enough to burn the back of the throat. It was a necessary cruelty. The trackers of the Alpha King possessed senses honed to detect a single drop of royal blood across miles of open forest. Against the natural world, Alistair's hounds were infallible, but against the dense, artificial pollution of Blackport, they were blind, provided Clara maintained the chemical barrier. She began to scrub his shoulders. The sponge was abrasive, and the mixture stripped the natural oils from the skin, leaving it dry and tight. Pip endured the washing with a quiet stoicism that broke Clara's heart, a discipline inherited not from the human world, but from a survival instinct he was too young to fully comprehend. Then the sponge passed over his left knee. Pip let out a sharp, sudden whimper, his small frame jerking backward, splashing lukewarm water onto the floorboards. Clara froze, her hands instantly dropping the sponge. She leaned forward, her heart seizing with the intense hypervigilance that had become her constant shadow. But Pip was not looking at the window. He was not reacting to a sound on the stairs or a threatening scent on the wind. He was looking down at his own leg. There, just below his kneecap, was a fresh, angry red scrape. It was a perfectly ordinary injury, the kind a human boy acquired from tripping on the rough cobblestones of the alley behind the bakery while chasing a stray cat. The raw vinegar from the mixture had seeped into the open scratch, stinging fiercely. Clara let out a slow, controlled breath, the tension leaving her shoulders in a long, quiet release. Not an assassin, not a tracker, just a scraped knee. She set the sponge aside and reached for a clean cup of clear water, pouring it gently over the wound to flush the burning acid away. "I am sorry," she whispered, her thumb brushing the uninjured skin beside the scrape. "I know it bites. We have to make sure the dirt is gone." Pip sniffled, rubbing his nose with a wet wrist. He did not ask why they had to smell like sour chemicals and burnt wood every single night. He only nodded, trusting her hands as she carefully dabbed the knee dry with a piece of rough linen. She did not apply the mixture over the cut again. Instead, she reached for a small tin of basic human medical salve, beeswax and comfrey, and spread it over the scrape. It smelled faintly of earth, safe and unremarkable. When the washing was done, Clara wrapped him in a thick, patched wool blanket and lifted him onto the narrow cot. The room smelled terribly of vinegar, but as she sat beside him in the dim light of the dying stove, listening to the steady rhythm of his breathing, she felt the particular kind of peace that comes not from comfort, but from absolute security. They were dirty, they were cold, and for the first time in 6 years, they were entirely invisible. The morning air in their cramped attic room tasted heavily of sulfur and the sharp, acidic sting of their homemade chemical mask. Clara wiped the damp cloth across Pip's neck, watching the dark liquid seep into the collar of his faded linen shirt. He did not pull away. He had learned the physical mechanics of this routine before he could speak in full sentences. The scent was suffocating, meticulously masking the fresh ozone and pine of his natural biology under a heavy layer of industrial waste. Again, Clara instructed quietly, setting the cloth down on the edge of the cracked wash basin. Pip stood in the center of the warped wooden floorboards, his small hands resting flat against his sides. He was 6 years old, but his posture already held the unnerving, perfect stillness of a court-born heir. That was the immediate danger. Wolves moved with an economy of motion that humans entirely lacked. They did not stumble, they did not hesitate, and they did not drop things clumsily. To survive in Blackport, the boy had to learn how to be physically unremarkable. Clara picked up a long, battered wooden spoon from the small kitchen table. She held it at shoulder height, directly in front of him. "Remember the rule," she said, her voice dropping into a flat, measured rhythm. She opened her fingers. The spoon plummeted toward the floor. Before it could fall past his waist, Pip's hand shot out. His small fingers clamped around the wooden handle in a blur of motion, stopping the utensil inches from the ground. It was an involuntary reflex, lightning fast and biologically ingrained. A human child would have missed the object entirely. Clara let out a slow, controlled breath. She did not raise her voice, nor did her hand tremble on the wooden table. "It's too fast," she observed softly. "Humans do not catch falling objects before they realize they have fallen. You are anticipating the drop." Pip fixed his eyes on the spoon, his small jaw tightening, his knuckles turning white at his sides. He despised the artificial clumsiness she demanded of him. "My hands just know where it is going to be," he muttered, the crisp, precise enunciation of his inherited lineage slipping through his teeth. "Then you must teach your hands to forget," the mother replied. She took the spoon back, her own movements deliberately sluggish. "You must wait. You must let it hit the floor, or you must reach for it and miss. The moment they see you move faster than the eye can follow, they will not see a boy. They will see a wolf." She raised the wooden handle again. "Count to 10 in your head, slowly. 1 number for every heartbeat. Do not move until you reach 7. She released the wood. The spoon fell, clattering loudly against the uneven floorboards, bouncing once before settling near his scuffed boots. Pip's shoulders twitched, his fingers curling slightly as his body fought the overwhelming instinct to intercept the movement. He held his ground. He waited until the wood was completely still, and then he bent down, his movements intentionally uncoordinated, and scooped it up. "Good," Clara murmured, taking the utensil from him. "Now speak. Tell me what you did." The boy took a breath, letting his shoulders slump slightly, shedding the rigid military posture of his bloodline. When he spoke, he forced his vowels to broaden, dragging the syllables through the back of his throat to mimic the thick, flat human accent of the city's working class. "I dropped the spoon, ma'am. I'll pick it up proper next time." It was a tragic kind of education. In the sovereign court, a pup's speed was praised, cultivated, and celebrated in the training rings. Here, biology was a strict liability. Survival meant breaking his own grace, piece by piece, until nothing but a soot-smeared, ordinary human boy remained. The office at the front of the coal yard was built of cracked brick and clouded glass, constantly vibrating from the rumble of heavy wagons outside. The air inside smelled of raw anthracite, old parchment, and dry ink. Clara sat at a high wooden desk in the corner, her fingers covered in a thin layer of black grease. It was not a lack of hygiene, but a calculated defense. The grime masked the scent of her skin and disguised the smooth, uncalloused hands of a former court lady. Spread out before her were the day's shipping ledgers, vast grids of numbers tracking the movement of tar, coal, and timber across the territory. Beneath the heavy leather cover of the bottommost ledger rested her forged registry papers. They declared her to be a human widow named Vance, a document constructed with meticulous care during her first week in the city. The papers were flawless in their legal structure, but flawless documents drew the eyes of municipal inspectors. Real human clerks made mistakes. Clara dipped her steel quill into the inkwell, her posture hunched deliberately to mimic the weary slump of the yard's other labourers. She began to copy the morning's tonnage into the main ledger. Her natural handwriting was an elegant, flowing script, drilled into her over a decade of administrative training in the northern keeps. Here, she could not use it. Perfect calligraphy belonged to royal archivists and high-born scribes, not a destitute widow working for copper coins. She tightened her grip on the quill, forcing her hand to stiffen awkwardly. She shaped the letters with blunt, uneven strokes, letting the ink pool slightly at the bottom of the numbers. When she finished a column, she dragged the fleshy side of her palm across the wet ink on the bottom corner of the page. The dark liquid smeared across the parchment, creating a messy, unremarkable blur. The heavy door to the office swung open, letting in a gust of cold, sulphur-laced wind. Bartholomew Gedge walked in, shaking the soot from his heavy wool coat. The owner of the yard was a gruff, practical man whose entire world revolved around profit margins and supply lines. He valued accuracy over pleasantries, which suited Clara perfectly. The man approached her desk, peering over her shoulder at the open ledger. Clara did not freeze, nor did she flinch away from his proximity. She simply kept her head down, continuing her blunt, uneven writing. 4 wagons missing from the Eastern Manifest, Bartholomew noted, his voice a low rumble. Did they weigh in at the lower scale? No, sir, she answered in a raspy, flattened tone, tapping the smudged corner of the page. They bypassed the lower scale. I cross-referenced the axle weight receipts from the toll gate. They were carrying slag, not prime anthracite. I adjusted the billing accordingly. He leaned closer, his human eyes scanning the messy rows of numbers. To anyone else, the ledger looked like the hasty, careless work of a distracted clerk. But the arithmetic was flawless. Every fraction of a ton was accounted for, every missing copper traced and corrected. The contradiction between the brilliant accounting and the sloppy presentation was her greatest armor. Good work, Mrs. Vance, the yard owner grunted, stepping back. He did not ask where she had learned to balance a ledger with such ruthless precision. He did not care about her past, only the black ink that kept his business out of debt. Clara simply nodded, offering no unnecessary explanations. Silence was a kind of armor, thinner than most, but lighter to carry. Leave the receipts on the spike when you finish, the older man added, walking toward his own desk across the room. Don't stay past dusk. The fog is coming in thick tonight. Yes, sirs, she murmured, dipping her quill again. She pressed her thumb against the edge of her forged registry papers, hidden beneath the book. Feeling the crisp texture of the parchment, survival was not achieved by hiding in the shadows. It was achieved by standing in plain sight and offering the world exactly what it expected to see. The cobblestones of Blackport did not welcome the wheels of royal carriages. Alistair Vaughan felt every rigid jolt through the velvet seat, his posture perfectly still as the heavy transport lumbered down the industrial thoroughfare. The air outside the glass was not merely air. It was a physical weight, a suffocating layer of sulfur, burned anthracite, and boiling factory runoff that tasted like copper in the back of the throat. He looked down at the field journal resting across his knees. Its heavy leather cover was already filming with a fine layer of grey ash that had managed to drift through the tight window seams. The pages inside tracked a desperate geometry, thousands of miles, hundreds of dead ends, and a relentless search that had yielded nothing but cold trails. Blackport was supposed to be a meticulous sweep. Instead, it was a sensory tomb. Outside the carriage window, the Sovereign Court's most elite tracking wolves were falling apart. These were beasts bred for the pristine northern ice, predators capable of isolating a single thread of biological scent across 50 miles of freezing rain. In the shadow of the smokestacks, they were entirely incapacitated. The king watched in grim, silent observation as his lead tracker dropped heavily to the muddy pavement. The massive silver wolf sneezed violently, a wet, hacking sound that shook its entire muscular frame. It dragged its sensitive snout desperately against the rusted base of an iron lamp post, trying to scrape the burning sulfur from its nasal passages. Another tracker whined sharply in distress, pawing at its own face before burying its wet nose in a pile of damp, chemical-stained gravel just to escape the airborne toxins. The low-tech reality of urban pollution was systematically dismantling the biological advantage of the pack. There was no ancient magic here capable of parting the smog. There was only coal, and it coated every surface, every breath, and every secret. He closed the field journal, the heavy thump of the thick parchment swallowed completely by the mechanical roar of nearby steam engines. Alistair felt a deep, tightening pressure in his chest. It was not anger. It was a profound and hollow exhaustion born from realizing his immense authority meant absolutely nothing in this mechanical wasteland. He watched his guards attempt to pull the suffering wolves back into a disciplined formation, their heavy leather boots slipping on the oily, tar-slicked street. The Sovereign did not bark orders or demand the impossible. He simply occupied the silence of his carriage, letting the abrasive reality of the human city dictate their agonizingly slow, blind crawl through the soot. 2 blocks away, looking down through the filthy glass of an attic window, Clara Vance did not breathe. She stood perfectly still, her hands resting on the cold windowsill, watching the heavy black transport crawl down the main avenue. The soot on the glass was thick, but it was not thick enough to obscure the royal sigil, stamped into the dark wood of the door. The gold paint caught the dull afternoon light just once, but once was enough. Her past had finally driven into her city. She did not panic. Panic was a luxury for women who had someone else to rely on. Clara stepped back from the window, pulling the heavy canvas curtain shut, plunging the small room into shadows. Pip was sitting on the threadbare rug, playing quietly with a collection of smooth stones. She touched his shoulder, a silent command he knew well. The boy stood up immediately, his small face serious, sensing the sudden shift in the room's atmospheric pressure. Moving straight to the rusted paraffin stove in the corner of their flat. Her hands worked with mechanical precision, entirely devoid of trembling. She retrieved the cast-iron pot they used exclusively for their camouflage. She poured in the sharp, clear liquid, followed by a heavy, viscous scoop of raw industrial waste. This was an extra-strength batch of the noxious barrier. The daily wash was painful enough, but the presence of royal trackers required absolute sensory erasure. She struck a match. The stove flared to life, heating the iron bottom of the pot until the chemical stench began to rise. It was a brutal, eye-watering smell that stripped the moisture from the air and clawed at the back of the throat. The tiny flat quickly filled with the suffocating vapor. Clara stood over the stove, stirring the thick black slurry with a wooden spoon, letting the awful heat bake into her skin and hair. She felt her eyes burning, the sting producing involuntary tears, but she did not blink. Pip stood beside her. The 6-year-old boy coughed silently, pressing his small soot-stained hands over his mouth to muffle the sound. He knew the rules. He never complained about the burning air or the stinging skin. The mother looked down at him, her heart executing a slow, heavy beat against her ribs. She crouched down to his level, dipping a ragged cloth into the cooling edges of the dark, abrasive liquid. She wrung it out, the dark liquid dripping heavily onto the wooden floorboards. She wiped the foul-smelling cloth across the back of his neck, over the pulse points, where a wolf scent was strongest. The child squeezed his eyes shut, his shoulders bunching against the sharp sting of the acid and the heavy, suffocating grease of the tar, but he remained perfectly still. Clara worked methodically, erasing the faint, sweet scent of a royal air under layers of industrial grime. The physical environment was unglamorous, harsh, and bordering on cruel, but it was the only fortress she had left. As long as they smelled like the bottom of a coal chute, the trackers would pass right by them. The northern trackers were built for the freezing winds of the high sovereign territories. They were not built for Blackport. Down the narrow, soot-choked residential lanes, Alistair Vaughan watched his finest hunters fail. The smog here did not float. It hung at waist level, a dense yellow-grey fog composed of sulphur, unburned coal dust, and industrial exhaust. Every breath drawn by a werewolf felt like swallowing crushed glass. Alistair walked in silence behind his lead tracker, his dark velvet cloak absorbing the damp ash falling from the chimneys above. They were moving through the edge of the working-class district. Behind these peeling wooden doors and fog-stained windows, thousands of human labourers were boiling their work clothes. The air was overwhelmingly saturated with the sharp, acidic sting of the tar and vinegar mixture. It was a common industrial solvent used by the dock workers and coal hands to strip grease from their skin, but to a werewolf's highly calibrated olfactory glands, it was practically a chemical weapon. The lead tracker stopped at the corner of a cramped alleyway, coughing violently into a linen handkerchief. His eyes were watering, completely blinded to anything beyond the immediate stench of burning sulphur. Alistair did not reprimand the man. He knew the biological limitation they were hitting. He felt it too. The sovereign power of an alpha king was designed to command living things, not to outmaneuver a mountain of industrial waste. Yet, just as the wind shifted down the narrow corridor, Alistair froze. Underneath the overpowering reek of the pungent masking agent, a faint, impossible ghost of a scent drifted past the damp brick. It was the smell of cold northern frost and rain-washed pine. It was a fragment so small it barely registered, but his chest tightened with an immediate instinctual recognition. He turned his head sharply, orienting toward the specific cluster of tenement buildings on the left. He took a fast, desperate step forward. His foot sank directly into a shallow depression between the cobblestones. The puddle was not water. It was a concentrated pool of chemical runoff from the nearby textile mill. A sharp, hissing sizzle rose instantly from the ground as the highly corrosive liquid ate into the expensive leather of his high riding boots. The sudden, acrid smoke of burning leather and chemical lye shot straight up into his face. Alistair inhaled the toxic fume sharply. He choked, stepping back and blinking against the intense chemical burn in his eyes. By the time he recovered his vision and steadied his breathing, the wind had died down entirely. The faint trace of northern frost was gone. The alley smelled only of hot leather, lye, and the endless, crushing soot of the city. He stood in the narrow lane, looking up at the hundreds of identical, fog-shrouded windows, entirely unaware that the son he was searching for was sleeping safely behind one of them. The private office of Julian Mercer was a carefully maintained anomaly within the grimy borders of the industrial city. Located on the second floor of a sturdy brick building, the room smelled of polished mahogany, dry paper and ink, insulated from the sulphurous streets below by heavy velvet curtains. Alistair stood near the center of the room, refusing the offered leather chair. His boots left faint, ashen outlines on the pristine woven rug, the leather still slightly discolored from the chemical burn in the alleyway. Julian sat behind a massive desk, his posture relaxed but highly attentive. The human lawyer did not flinch under the oppressive, quiet weight of the Alpha King's presence. He was a man of the city, a pragmatist who valued signed contracts and legal boundaries far more than the biological dominance of a sovereign wolf. "Your trackers are attempting to read a book in a pitch-black room, Your Grace," Julian said, his voice flat and perfectly measured. "Blackport processes 80,000 tons of raw coal a month. Our rivers run orange with iron slag. Whatever scent you believe is hidden here, the city has already swallowed it whole." Alistair did not argue. He turned his attention to the large, hand-drawn map pinned to the lawyer's wall. He stared at the geometric grid of the city, his jaw setting into a hard, rigid line. He traced the heavy black ink lines representing the different districts. There was no poetry in this place. There were no natural landmarks for a wolf to navigate. He was looking at streets named after industrial output: Coal Seam Avenue, Iron Slag Row, Burners Lane, Tar Barrel Alley. He realized with a cold, settling certainty that his absolute sovereign authority meant absolutely nothing here. You could not issue a royal decree to the smog. You could not command the soot to part. "I need access to the municipal records," Alistair stated, his voice low and devoid of unnecessary emotion. Every new resident, every laborer, every woman who relocated to this city within the last 6 years. Julian unlocked a heavy iron drawer at the base of his desk. He lifted a massive stack of administrative documents and set them on the mahogany surface with a dull thud. These were the standard municipal logs, heavily padded with forged registry papers from the countless undocumented workers seeking a new life in the industrial boom. "We register hands, not histories," Julian replied, pushing the stack slightly toward the king. "These contain names, weekly wages, and tax stamps. If the woman you seek wished to disappear, a bustling port built on transient labor is the perfect place to do it." 1,000 women matching her general description have signed these ledgers. Alistair grimly surveyed the sheer volume of paperwork. Each page represented a labyrinth of human aliases and ink-stained survival. His fingers brushed the edge of the forged registry papers, scanning the endless columns of identical, neat handwriting. The legal and administrative machinery of the human world was a different kind of armor, thicker and more complex than any pack border. He stood in the quiet office, surrounded by the physical evidence of his own limitations, preparing to dismantle the city's records line by line. The official seal on the courier's parchment was pressed in dark red wax, the imposing emblem of the sovereign court gleaming coldly in the grey, dust-filtered light of the coal yard office. Bartholomew Gedge stared at the document as if it were a live serpent coiled upon his cluttered wooden desk. The written notice of a royal audit mandated that all local shipping and transport records be made available for immediate inspection by Alistair Vaughan's personal retinue. The men were already working their way down the commercial block, sealing doors and demanding ledgers. Gedge's broad, soot-stained face had gone a remarkable shade of ash, his usual gruff demeanor evaporating into pure, unfiltered panic. He began to move about the cramped room with a frantic, uncharacteristic, nervous energy, muttering dark curses under his breath as he kicked aside stray lumps of anthracite, and hastily gathered up loose delivery manifests that had spilled onto the floorboards. Clara Vance stood by the slanted drafting table, her posture perfectly straight, her hands clasped loosely in front of her coarse woolen apron. She did not allow the sudden, sharp spike of adrenaline to alter the steady rhythm of her breathing. Panic was a dangerous luxury she had discarded on the riverbank 6 years ago. Instead of freezing, she went methodically to work. She focused immediately on the carriage ledger. The heavy, leather-bound volume rested at the edge of the table, containing the meticulous records of every wagon, dray, and coach that had transported Blackport's fuel over the past year. Clara opened the thick cover and ran her calloused fingers over the pale parchment pages, double-checking the ink entries she had logged just that morning. She had spent years training her hand to produce a slightly irregular, blotty script, ensuring that no royal scribe could ever recognize the elegant, mathematically perfect penmanship of a former pack elite. The ink strokes looked exactly like the hurried work of a tired, overworked human clerk. Gedge, meanwhile, had located a tarnished brass inkwell buried under a pile of unpaid invoices. Terrified of the king's brutal reputation and the crushing, suffocating aura of the predatory wolves currently marching through the city streets, the gruff owner spat directly onto his ragged sleeve and began polishing the brass with frantic, jerking motions. The sheer absurdity of the gesture. A terrified human attempting to appease apex predators with a shiny piece of desk metal, and chored the bookkeeper firmly in the present reality. She watched the older man scrub the metal, listening to his ragged, fearful breathing, and felt the familiar heavy weight of her own chosen invisibility. She quietly closed the heavy book and pushed it to the exact center of the desk, perfectly aligned for the approaching auditors, building her defensive wall entirely out of mundane administrative compliance. The heavy, echoing toll of the yard bell signaled that the royal vanguard had reached the end of the cobblestone street. Clara calculated she had exactly 3 minutes before the heavy office door would swing open. She moved swiftly through the narrow back corridor of the building, pulling Pip Vance into a damp, windowless storage closet that smelled sharply of lye, wet slate, and decaying floorboards. The young boy had been sweeping the outer steps, his face already dusted with a fine layer of grey ash, but today superficial dirt would not be nearly enough to deceive the sovereign. His mother knelt on the freezing stone floor, reaching deep into her apron pocket to retrieve a small, corked glass bottle. The potent solvent inside was highly concentrated, possessing an odor so sharply acidic and bitterly chemical that it made her own eyes water the moment she unstoppered it. She poured a generous, dark measure of the liquid onto a coarse scrap of linen. Without a word of apology, she began to rub the stinging fluid into the thick fabric of Pip's collar, pressing it deep into the seams where a pup's natural scent glands were most active. The child flinched, his small shoulders rising instinctively as the acid burned his sensitive skin. But he did not make a sound. He had been taught the absolute necessity of total silence, absorbing her rigid, unyielding discipline as his only reliable shield against a world he did not fully understand. When she was satisfied that the boy smelled of nothing but industrial waste and bitter chemical, the woman turned the damp rag upon herself. The physical masking required a toll that went far beyond mere discomfort. She poured the remainder of the dark, caustic liquid directly into her cupped palms. The elite wolves accompanying the retinue possessed olfactory senses capable of detecting a single bead of nervous sweat or a microscopic flake of clean skin beneath layers of heavy winter wool. Clara scooped a handful of raw pulverized coal dust from a wooden bucket in the corner and ground it mercilessly into her own hands, She scrubbed her knuckles and pressed the sharp, abrasive grit directly into her nail beds. She kept rubbing, driving the toxic soot into the natural crevices of her flesh until her cuticles split and began to bleed slightly. The faint, coppery scent of fresh blood was immediately neutralized by the overwhelming, suffocating stench of the caustic brew, locking her biological identity firmly beneath a chemical burn. She flexed her stinging, blackened fingers, feeling the familiar, steadying ache of the self-inflicted wounds. It was a brutal, necessary arithmetic. A few drops of blood shed in the darkness of a closet ensured the survival of her son in the light. She wiped the excess grit onto her apron, took a slow, measured breath of the toxic air, and pushed the storage door open to face the heavy, approaching footsteps. The heavy oak door of Bartholomew Gedge's office did not just open, it yielded, its rusted iron hinges groaning under a sudden, terrifying shift in atmospheric pressure. Clara did not look up from her inkwell. She kept her chin lowered, her shoulders rounded into the subservient slouch of a hired human clerk, even as the temperature in the room plummeted. The scent of winter pine and ozone, a smell she had not encountered in 6 years, pressed into the cramped space, fighting a losing war against the overwhelming stench of burning sulfur and wet ash. Alistair walked into the room. The Alpha King did not speak immediately. He occupied silence the way other men occupied speech, without apology, without the nervous impulse to fill it. His heavy boots thudded against the warped floorboards, closing the distance to the main counter. The bookkeeper kept her eyes fixed on the drying ink of the manifest. Her breathing remained strictly calibrated, in through the nose, counting to 4, out through the mouth. The foul concoction layered thick across her skin, and hair radiated a sharp, acidic burn, stinging her pores and masking the underlying scent of her true nature. "I require the outbound shipping logs for the past 3 weeks," the Sovereign said. His voice was a low, resonant baritone that sent a microscopic tremor through the wooden desk. Bartholomew cleared his throat, his gruff human bravado shrinking under the sheer physical mass of the man standing before him. "The logs are bound by the clerk, my lord." Clara moved with deliberate, mechanical slowness. She reached out with hands completely stained by black coal grease, her fingernails packed with soot. She slid the carriage ledger across the scarred wood of the counter. She did not raise her head. She did not offer a greeting. Alistair stepped closer to the desk to inspect the heavy leather-bound book. As he shifted his weight, the thick, fur-lined hem of his dark velvet cloak brushed against the edge of the workspace. The heavy fabric caught the lip of a shallow wooden sorting tray. The tray flipped. Dozens of sharp steel pins scattered across the floorboards with a sharp metallic clatter. The sound was a violent intrusion in the quiet room. The yard owner flinched. The king simply stopped moving, his gaze dropping toward the mess at his feet. Clara did not gasp. She did not offer a frantic human apology. She simply slipped down from her high wooden stool, dropping to her knees on the filthy floor. She lowered her head until her face was inches from the scuffed leather of his boots. The smell of northern frost radiating from the man was almost agonizingly familiar. She ignored it. She began picking up the steel pins one by one, her grease-stained fingers moving with absolute, rhythmic precision. She focused entirely on the physical task. 1 pin, 2 pins, 3. The cold metal grounded her. Alistair stood inches away, a towering apex predator, his eyes fixed on the open pages of the carriage ledger, entirely unaware that the woman he had spent years dismantling a court to find was currently sweeping the floor beneath his boots. While she was still kneeling in the dust, the back door of the office rattled on its latch. The hinges shrieked, and a small figure dragged himself over the threshold. Pip had arrived. He was carrying a dented iron coal bucket that was nearly half his size. The boy was covered head to toe in thick, black soot, his clothes smelling fiercely of the fresh toxic paste his mother had scrubbed into his skin that morning. He dropped the heavy bucket onto the floor with a loud clang, the noise echoing sharply against the stone walls. The sovereign turned away from the carriage ledger. He looked down. Beneath the desk, Clara's hand clamped around a steel pin so tightly that the sharp point pierced the callus of her thumb. A single drop of blood welled up, immediately neutralized by the thick layer of coal grease on her skin. She did not breathe. She watched the tips of the king's boots shift toward her son. Pip did not freeze. He did not widen his eyes or show the sudden submissive panic of a wolf pup encountering an alpha. He simply looked up at the towering man in the velvet cloak, wiped a streak of black dust away from his nose with a filthy sleeve, and reached deep into the pocket of his oversized trousers. The boy pulled out a greasy, bent human copper coin. He held it up toward the apex predator, his small face set in a mask of dull, transactional indifference. "Entry tax," the child said. His voice was flat, slurred, and perfectly shaped by the harsh vowels of the Blackport slums. There was no pack deference in his tone, no hidden royal inflection. He sounded exactly like one of the thousands of desperate, half-starved human orphans who worked the city's industrial yards, demanding a tip for simply breathing the same air as a wealthy traveller. Alistair stared at the bent copper coin in the child's outstretched, soot-stained hand. The sovereign's expression remained perfectly unreadable, but the stillness in his shoulders betrayed a profound, heavy weariness. He was an alpha, searching for a ghost, and all he had found in this sulfur-choked city was the crushing, miserable reality of human poverty. He did not take the coin. He did not lean in to catch the boy's scent, because the child smelled only of industrial waste and cheap, acidic vinegar. The king merely looked at the small figure for a long, silent moment, recognizing nothing of his own lineage in the dirty, hardened face. Slowly, Alistair turned his back on his son. He returned his attention to the pages of the carriage ledger, dismissing the boy entirely. Pip shrugged a perfectly executed gesture of street-level apathy and shoved the bent coin back into his pocket. He picked up the heavy coal bucket and dragged it toward the iron stove in the corner, his footsteps heavy and uneven on the floorboards. Beneath the desk, Clara released her grip on the steel pin. She let the trapped air out of her lungs in a long, invisible exhale, the cold floor pressing against her knees as she continued to gather the scattered metal. She was a ghost, and her son was just a shadow in the soot. They had survived. The heavy oak door of the office clicked shut, sealing the freezing draft of the street outside. For a long, agonizing moment, the only sound in the small room was the violent rattle of the window panes. Clara stood completely motionless behind the scarred desk. She listened closely as the heavy wooden wheels of the black carriage began to turn, grinding against the uneven, frost-slicked cobblestones of Blackport. The rhythmic clopping of the Royal Guard's horses slowly faded into the chaotic din of the industrial district. The clanking of iron chains, the distant shrieks of the steam whistles, and the constant, hacking coughs of the dock workers rushed back in to fill the void left by the king's departure. The sovereign pressure that had squeezed all the oxygen from the room finally lifted, replaced by the familiar heavy smog of the human city. Clara did not allow herself to collapse immediately. She kept her spine rigidly straight, her ink-stained hands pressed flat against the wooden surface of her desk, waiting until she was absolutely certain the carriage was gone. Only then did she allow the breath to exit her lungs. It came out as a long, jagged exhale that tasted bitterly of sulfur, panic, and the overpowering reek of the harsh chemical solvent. Her knees finally gave out. She sank toward the scuffed floorboards, the stiff fabric of her woolen skirt folding awkwardly beneath her. A few feet away, Pip dropped his heavy iron bucket. The raw anthracite spilled over the rim, sending a cloud of thick black dust puffing up around his small, worn boots. He had been so incredibly brave. He had held his flat human accent perfectly when questioned by the towering sovereign. He had kept his eyes downcast, playing the part of a mindless, soot-smeared street urchin without a single hesitation. But beneath the rigid discipline of their daily drills, he was still only a 6-year-old child. His small shoulders began to shake, the adrenaline leaving his small frame in a sudden, violent rush. Clara pulled him into her chest, wrapping her arms securely around his trembling back. She buried her face in his coarse collar, breathing in the sharp, chemical burn of the camouflage that had just saved their lives. Pip let out a small, muffled sob, his tiny fingers clutching the fabric of her apron. Clara reached into her deep pocket and pulled out a heavy, grease-stained rag she usually used to polish the iron stove. Her hands were still shaking violently as she lifted the coarse cloth to his face. She wiped the tears from his cheeks in absolute silence, her motions slow, measured, and deliberate. The rough fabric dragged across his delicate skin, leaving thick, dark grey streaks of carbon smeared across his pale face. It was a dirty, messy comfort. There was no cinematic grace in their survival, no grand, sweeping declarations of safety. There was only the grinding, unglamorous reality of hiding in the dirt. She silently wiped another tear from his chin, replacing it with a smudge of black grease. The Alpha King had stood mere inches away from his own heir. He had breathed the same stagnant air, looked directly at the boy's face, and he had seen absolutely nothing. The administrative camouflage had held. Their forged registry papers remained unquestioned. They were safe for another afternoon. But the sheer terror of the near-miss settled into Clara's bones like cold lead, pinning her to the floor of the coal yard as she held her child in the grey shadows. The freezing draft, seeping upward through the floorboards, eventually forced Clara to move. Bartholomew Gedge would return from the upper loading docks soon, and the office needed to look entirely undisturbed. She stood up, her joints popping in the quiet room, and gently guided her son to the small wooden stool beside the dormant iron stove. Taking a deep, stabilizing breath, she turned her attention back to the massive desk. The carriage ledger lay exactly where Alistair had left it. It was a heavy, unwieldy book bound in thick leather and reinforced with brass corner hinges. It contained the meticulous records of every ton of anthracite and industrial tar shipped in and out of Blackport. Clara reached out to close the massive volume, intending to return it to the heavy iron safe beneath the floor. As her rough fingers brushed the spine, she felt a subtle, almost imperceptible irregularity. Clara paused. Her thumb traced the brass corner hinges, moving deliberately down to the metal spine plate. One of the flathead screws securing the brass binding was slightly elevated. It sat a fraction of a millimeter higher than the others, its edge catching sharply against the pad of her thumb. It had not been like that this morning. She was the primary bookkeeper for the yard. She spent 10 hours a day managing these exact texts. She knew every scuff, every loose thread, and every physical defect of her ledgers with absolute certainty. She leaned closer over the desk, the faint, lingering scent of pine and ozone. The king's distinct scent still clung to the worn leather, fighting against the overwhelming smell of coal dust. Clara reached up and pulled a rusted iron hairpin from the tight coil of her dark hair. Her hair loosened slightly, falling over her shoulder as she wedged the flat edge of the pin into the tiny groove of the screw. It was tedious, mechanical work. The rusted iron bit sharply into her fingertips as she applied steady, downward pressure, twisting the makeshift tool against the stubborn brass. The screw groaned in the quiet room, resisting her efforts for a long, frustrating minute before it finally gave way with a sharp, metallic click. She worked it loose, her breathing growing shallow as the metal thread released. Once the screw was fully removed, The small brass plate shifted downward. Beneath it lay a narrow, hollowed-out cavity, carved directly into the thick wooden spine of the ledger. Clara set the hairpin down, her brow furrowing in deep confusion. Inside the hidden groove lay a tightly rolled piece of high-grade vellum, no thicker than a goose quill. She extracted the tiny cylinder with careful, trembling fingers. It was not a warrant for her arrest. It was not a bounty notice demanding the return of a runaway mate. As she unrolled the tiny parchment on the scarred wood of the desk, the faint but undeniable mark of a royal wax seal caught the dim amber light of the oil lamp. She recognized the sovereign crest immediately. It was a formal protection decree. The words were written in a microscopic, precise hand, detailing absolute amnesty, guaranteed legal sanctuary, and the immediate execution of any wolf who dared threaten the bearer. At the bottom rested Alistair's personal signature in black ink. Clara stared at the document, the truth settling into her chest like a stone dropping through still water. He had not been randomly checking shipping logs to track fugitives. He had been systematically planting safety decrees in the administrative registries of the human border towns. He was not hunting the city to drag her back by force. He was quietly leaving a paper trail of absolute legal protection, hoping her meticulous eyes would eventually find it. The ink on the public royal edicts was sharp, stamped with the heavy wax seal of the sovereign court. Clara smoothed the frayed edges of the broadsheets she had collected over the years, pressing them flat against the oak of her kitchen table. The wood was cold, slick with a fine layer of soot that seeped through the window frames. Over the past 6 years, the human city of Blackport had received regular administrative updates from the Northern Territories. Postings of maritime trade laws, seasonal border closures, and high treason executions. She placed her own forged registry papers beside the stack of royal decrees. The false documents declared her a human widow, anchoring her safety in bureaucratic fiction. For years, she had operated under a single assumption. The sovereign was hunting her to reclaim his property, determined to drag a pregnant mate back into the lethal political machinery operated by her stepmother. Not because she believed Alistair wanted her dead, but because she knew he was bound by pack laws that favored the strong. Now, under the flickering light of a single tallow candle, Clara began to meticulously cross-reference the dates. She traced the timeline of her escape. The freezing night she left her ruined linen dress on the rocky riverbank to simulate a fatal wolf attack. Against the official logs of court purges, Regina Thorne had commanded the inner council with absolute authority, weaving a network of corrupt betas designed to eliminate any rival to her own bloodline. Yet, precisely 3 weeks after Clara's supposed drowning, the first royal decree had been signed. A beta loyal to her stepmother had been stripped of rank and hanged in the public square for conspiracy. Clara's ink-stained finger moved slowly down the dense ledger. 2 months later, 3 more names vanished from the registry. 4 months after that, a high-ranking border guard, the exact man who had allowed Regina's assassins into the royal wing that fateful night, was executed for gross negligence. She checked the overlapping dates of the king's public movements. According to the port's shipping logs, the sovereign's private carriage had not been at the capital during those executions. Alistair had been in the deep northern forests, systematically tearing apart the frozen wilderness searching for her body, while his appointed magistrates handled the execution of her enemies back at the keep. He had not forgotten. He had spent half a decade dismantling Regina's corrupt power structure, piece by piece, ensuring that the court would be sterilized of threats. The realization settled into her chest like a stone dropping through still water. Slow, thorough, filling every crack. The Alpha King had not come to Blackport to drag her back to a cage. He had come because the cage was finally broken. She stared at the forged registry papers that had kept Pip breathing for 6 years. She had survived by calculating every risk with cold administrative precision. Yet, sitting in the quiet kitchen, Clara found her protective mathematics crumbling against the undeniable weight of the king's methodical devotion. The small apartment smelled faintly of damp wool and the ever-present sulphur of the industrial city. Clara pushed the heavy documents away and stood, the chair legs scraping softly against the floorboards. She walked quietly toward the narrow alcove where her son slept, her footsteps practiced and completely silent. Pip was curled beneath a coarse wool blanket, his face smudged with the faint shadow of coal dust from his chores. The abrasive compound they used daily left a permanent, sharp tang in the air, a harsh chemical barrier that had successfully blinded the greatest tracking wolves on the continent just hours ago. She knelt beside the low iron cot, listening to the slow, steady rhythm of his breathing. Beyond the thin glass of the frosted window, the industrial heart of Blackport was fully awake. The distant, rhythmic thud of the steel mill echoed through the floorboards, shaking the soot from the eaves. Most wolves would have been driven entirely mad by the noise, craving the deep, natural silence of the pine forests. Clara found deep comfort in the mechanical roar. The heavy industry was not a prison, but a fortress. The deafening noise meant anonymity. The thick grey smog meant safety. She had learned to love the soot because it asked no personal questions, required no submission, and demanded no blood. But hiding was no longer a temporary tactic. It was becoming a permanent state of exile. Pip stirred in his sleep, his small, calloused fingers curling around the frayed edge of the blanket. He was growing fast, his inherited werewolf reflexes becoming harder to suppress beneath his carefully trained human accent and hunched posture. The daily acid scrub was beginning to deeply irritate his sensitive skin, leaving raw, red patches along his collarbone that no herbal salve could fully heal. She could keep running. She could burn the forged registry papers in the hearth tonight, pack their single trunk before dawn, and disappear into another industrial slum. She could spend the next decade teaching Pip to mask his nature until he forgot what he was entirely, stripping him of his heritage to buy his safety. Or she could negotiate. Clara rested her hand on the freezing iron frame of the cot. She had all the proof she needed scattered across her kitchen table. Alistair was not a tyrant acting on crude biological impulse. He had acted with the exact same cold administrative patience she had used to survive. He respected the law. He respected documented truth and undeniable evidence. If she remained in the shadows forever, she would be allowing Regina's ghost to dictate her child's future. True sovereignty was not merely running from coercive power, but standing before it with undeniable terms. She would not return to the Northern Keep as a vulnerable, discarded Omega begging for protection. She would initiate contact on her own territory through strictly human channels, protected by human contract law. Tomorrow, she would find a pragmatic notary. She would draft a legally binding contract of absolute maternal independence, and she would force the Alpha King to meet her at a table, not as a captured runaway, but as an equal who held the only thing he truly wanted. The office of Julian Mercer was a narrow, unheated room above a haberdashery, smelling faintly of damp wool and sour ink. Clara sat rigidly in the visitor's chair, her gloved hands folded in her lap, the heavy wool of her coat still carrying the scent of coal tar. Between them lay her forged registry papers, the thick civic parchment, establishing her as a human citizen of Blackport under the name Vance. Julian stared at the documents, then up at his client, his spectacles sliding slightly down the bridge of his nose. "You want me to present a formal custody demand to the sovereign of the Northern Court," the human lawyer said, his voice entirely devoid of inflection. He tapped a brass paperweight against his desk. "I want you to present a treaty of independence." Clara corrected quietly. She did not raise her voice. She did not need to. The civic registry proves my standing here. My son is a resident of this municipality. The Crown has no legal jurisdiction to extract us by force without violating the regional trade agreements. I require a neutral buffer, a legal wall. Julian pinched the bridge of his nose. He reached for his quill, dipping it into a cracked porcelain inkwell. He was a man who valued contracts above all things, a pragmatic survivor in a city of industry, but even he recognized the danger of the request. Do you have any idea what they do to humans who interfere with pack hierarchy? The sovereign is not a port magistrate to be bullied by local statutes. He will not touch a bonded notary operating under the Blackport civic charter, the mother replied, her posture perfectly straight. Not when the king himself is currently auditing shipping routes to prove his adherence to the law. He is here seeking evidence, not blood. We will give him documentation. The logic settled into the room like a cold iron weight. Julian exhaled a long, slow breath, wiping a smudge of soot from his cuff. He pulled a fresh sheet of heavy drafting vellum toward himself. The nib of his pen scratched loudly against through paper. This ink is abysmal, the notary grumbled, shaking the quill to force a drop down the split nib, watered down by the supplier again. It feathers on the downstroke. If I am to be executed for treason by a wolf monarch, I would at least prefer my final testament to feature crisp calligraphy. Clara watched his ink-stained fingers move. The document took shape, clause by clause. She dictated the parameters with the precision she used to balance the coal yard ledgers. Absolute physical autonomy. No forced relocation to the royal keep. Her son's lineage acknowledged only on her explicit terms, with no immediate transfer of title or pack rank. The human lawyer translated her survival tactics into binding civic language, his complaints about the poor quality of the writing fluid, providing a strange, steadying rhythm against the sheer terror of what she was initiating. Julian blotted the final paragraph, the watery black fluid soaking into the drying sand. He attached a copy of her forged documentation to the back, binding it with a heavy linen thread. The treaty was a masterpiece of boundaries, built entirely on the foundation of her fake civic identity. She was not asking for a reunion, nor was she begging for royal mercy. She was establishing a legal border, and Julian was the gatekeeper. The Black Anchor Tavern was not a place suited for royalty. The air hung thick with the smell of stale ale, rendered mutton fat, and the ever-present sulphur of the industrial district. Alistair Vaughan occupied a scarred wooden table in the darkest corner of the taproom, his massive frame completely still amidst the chaos of shouting dock workers and clattering pewter mugs. He wore a heavy wool coat, devoid of royal insignia, but the sheer atmospheric pressure he exuded kept the local patrons at a wide, nervous distance. Julian approached the table, holding a leather satchel tightly against his chest. The human lawyer did not bow. He was a representative of the civic court, and bowing would immediately cede the jurisdictional high ground Clara had instructed him to maintain. He pulled out the chair opposite the monarch, the wooden legs scraping loudly against the floorboards. "Your Grace," Julian said, his voice flat, professional, betraying none of his internal anxiety. He slid the bound vellum document across the sticky, uneven surface of the table. "I represent a resident of this municipality. I have been instructed to deliver her terms regarding the custody and safety of her dependent." Alistair silently reviewed the paperwork. His gaze lingered on the copy of the civic registry attached to the back. The name Vance was written in Julian's feathered, watery ink. For a long moment, the sovereign did not speak. The realization of how thoroughly he had been outmaneuvered settled over him. His trackers had spent days searching for a hidden omega, hunting for a disrupted scent trail or a panicked wolf fleeing through the alleys. Instead, the woman he sought had seamlessly integrated herself into the human machinery, hiding in plain sight behind municipal stamps and coal yard ledgers. The Alpha King opened the document, reading the clauses in complete silence. He noted the demands for complete bodily independence, the refusal to return to the Northern Keep, and the assertion of her son's immediate safety. He did not growl, he did not slam his fist against the wood. Instead, a profound, heavy relief seemed to bleed the tension from his broad shoulders. She was alive. She was terrifyingly competent, and she was dictating the parameters of her own survival. "Do you require a signature, Mr. Mercer?" the king asked quietly, his low voice carrying effortlessly beneath the tavern's abrasive noise. "A formal acknowledgement of receipt, yes," the notary replied, pulling a stick of red wax and a small brass seal from his pocket. Alistair looked at the grease-stained wooden table. He reached inside his coat, extracting his own heavy golden signet ring bearing the crest of the Northern Court. He held the ring over the parchment, but then stopped. The sovereign refused to press his royal wax seal onto the filthy, ale-soaked surface of a tavern table. It was a matter of basic dignity, not just for himself, but for the treaty the mother of his heir had meticulously constructed. Without a word, Alistair lifted the heavy vellum, placing it flat against the solid leather cover of his own field journal. Only then did he allow Julian to melt the wax. The king pressed his seal into the hot red pool, the imprint sharp and undeniable. He handed the bound parchment back to the lawyer. The negotiation had officially begun, bound by civic law rather than pack dominance. The back room of Julian Mercer's notary office smelled of drying ink and the quiet accumulation of human bureaucracy. It was a sterile space, perfectly suited for the transaction of boundaries. Clara sat in the high-backed leather chair, her posture as straight and unyielding as the iron ledger stands flanking the walls. She wore a simple charcoal wool dress, devoid of pack insignia. Her hands rested flat on the polished oak table as she listened to the heavy footsteps approaching down the hallway. The door opened. The air grew instantly heavier under the gravitational weight of the Alpha King. Alistair Vaughan stepped over the threshold, his dark travelling coat dusted with the city's black soot. He did not speak immediately. He carried his silence not as an absence of words, but as a deliberate weight, refusing the nervous impulse to fill the quiet. His intense gaze locked onto Clara, cataloguing the reality of her survival after 6 years of believing she was a ghost. Before he could take a single step further into the room, Clara made her move. She reached into the deep pocket of her wool dress and retrieved a small glass jar. She unscrewed the metal lid with deliberate, unhurried precision. The faint clink of glass against the oak table sounded unnaturally loud in the silent room. She placed the open vessel exactly in the center of the wooden surface, directly between his chair and hers. Within seconds, the biting odor of white vinegar bloomed into the space. It was the core ingredient of the acrid camouflage she used every day to mask her existence. Now, stripped of the coal tar, the pure acidic scent stung the air, creating a harsh, invisible wall. To a wolf's highly sensitive olfactory glands, the smell was abrasive, almost painful. She was using the very instrument of her hiding as an active shield during their confrontation. The king stopped. He stared intensely at the small glass jar. His jaw tightened as he processed the message. It was a line drawn in acid, a demand for distance, a physical manifestation of the trust he had yet to earn. Alistair did not protest. Slowly, deliberately, he pulled out the wooden chair opposite her and sat down, keeping the jar centered between them. He rested his massive hands on his knees, refusing to crowd the table or push against the chemical wall. The acid stung his lungs with every breath, yet he breathed it in deeply, accepting the pain as the necessary cost of sitting in her presence. For a long time, the only sound in the notary's back room was the steady ticking of a brass grandfather clock in the corner. Then, a soft rustle of fabric came from the shadows near the tall, dust-covered bookshelf. Pip stepped forward into the narrow stream of afternoon light. For the first time since his birth, the boy was not covered in the protective grime of the coal yard. Clara had spent an hour washing away the thick layers of ash and sulphur. His skin was pale and clean, a stark contrast to the rough, soot-smeared child the sovereign had briefly observed days earlier. He wore a stiff new wool coat, buttoned meticulously to his chin. He stood quietly beside his mother's chair, his small hands holding the edge of her sleeve. He did not hide, but he did not rush forward either. He simply observed the massive stranger with the same analytical caution that kept his mother alive. Alistair's breath hitched. It was a fractional sound, but in the dense silence it resonated like a breaking timber. His eyes locked onto the boy. For 6 long years, the king had carried the crushing weight of a singular, horrifying image, a torn, bloody linen dress left abandoned on the jagged rocks of the northern rapids. That ruined garment had been the anchor of his grief, the ultimate proof of his failure to protect his family. He had built his vengeance upon that blood-stained fabric, dismantling the conspirators piece by piece, believing he was avenging a ghost. Now, the living, breathing reality of his son stood just 3 feet away. The child had his mother's steady, unblinking eyes and the unmistakable, sturdy jawline of the royal bloodline. Alistair leaned forward, the wood of his chair groaning under the shift in mass, his massive, battle-scarred right hand lifted slowly from his knee. The knuckles, thick with old calluses, trembled visibly. It was a raw, visceral reaction. A man who commanded legions, who had torn down a corrupt pack council with ruthless precision, was now physically shaken by the proximity of a 6-year-old boy. He reached across the table, his arm extending carefully past the biting perimeter of the vinegar jar. Clara did not speak, but her posture shifted. Her spine stiffened just a fraction of an inch, her chin lowering into a guarded angle. It was a microscopic adjustment, but in the highly calibrated geometry of the room, it was as loud as a shouted command. Alistair caught the movement instantly. His hand froze in mid-air, his fingers hovered mere inches from the rough fabric of Pip's new sleeve. He could feel the ambient warmth radiating from the child, could see the pulse beating steadily at the boy's collar. The biological urge to touch, to physically verify the survival of his heir, was a crushing pressure in his chest. But he looked at Clara's rigid shoulders, and then he looked down at the invisible wall of acid rising from the open glass jar. Slowly, agonizingly, the king curled his trembling fingers into a loose fist. He pulled his hand back, retreating across the oak table, respecting the absolute physical boundary she had set. He would not touch the boy without permission. He would not cross the line she had drawn. Alistair lowered his hand back to his knee, his eyes never leaving Pip's face, and offered the child a slow, solemn nod of absolute respect. Julian Mercer smoothed the binding of the final document against the heavy oak desk, his methodical movements echoing in the quiet office. The notary's back room smelled strongly of melting red seizing wax and damp, soot-stained wool. Outside the frosted window, the rhythmic clatter of coal carts provided a steady, mechanical metronome. Clara Vance pulled the thick stack of pages toward her. The texture beneath her fingertips was rough, porous, and utterly mundane. She had explicitly forbidden the use of the sovereign court's traditional medium. When the initial draft of the custody agreement arrived, inscribed on flawless calfskin, she pushed it back without a single word. This treaty would not be recorded on the materials of the people who plotted to drown her in the freezing rapids. It would be bound in the cheap, heavy human cartridge paper of the industrial district. It was the exact same thick stock that had held her forged registry papers for over half a decade. Across the narrow wooden table, Alistair Vaughan watched her examine the clauses. He made no move to rush her. He did not lean forward, nor did he attempt to assert physical dominance over the cramped space. He remained anchored in the low-backed wooden chair, his dark coat absorbing the weak afternoon light. Alistair occupied silence the way other men occupied speech, without apology, without the nervous impulse to fill it. Clara traced the ink on the third page, absolute custody of her son, the formal, irrevocable recognition of her status as an independent Duchess of the Borderlands. There would be no forced return to the treacherous northern capital. There would be no mandated pack integration for the boy until his 18th year. The words were rigid, heavily structured, and entirely devoid of romantic sentiment. They were administrative armor, forged in the exact legal language she had mastered while balancing ledgers in the coal yard. Julian handed her a steel-nibbed dip pen. It was a standard, mass-produced bookkeeping tool. She dipped the steel into the glass well and signed her name, not her old pack title. Just the name that had successfully bought flour, paid the weekly rent, and survived the suffocating soot. She pushed the stack of cartridge paper across the desk. The king took the pen from her hand. He did not scan the document for hidden loopholes. He already knew her conditions, and he possessed the tactical intelligence to know that a hesitation now would destroy the fragile bridge they had built. The sharp scratch of the steel nib against the rough paper was incredibly loud. He signed his name with slow, deliberate strokes, legally binding the highest authority of the wolves to the pragmatic terms of a human town. Removing his leather glove, he pressed his heavy gold sovereign ring into the pooling hot red wax. The contract was locked. Her independence was officially recorded. The ink dried faster on the porous surface than any promise ever could. The hearth in the main parlour of their newly purchased borderland estate burned with clean, dry cedar logs. There was no thick, suffocating cloud of industrial smoke pressing against the window panes. Clara sat near the fire in a high-backed armchair, a heavy woven wool blanket draped across her lap. Beside her, resting on the surface of a small oak reading table, sat the carriage ledger. Bartholomew Gedge had gifted the heavy leather-bound book to her upon her resignation from the coal yard. It was a practical memento honouring the single loose brass screw that had undone a royal hunt. She kept it nearby as concrete proof that survival was ultimately a matter of meticulous accounting. Alistair sat on the edge of the large stone hearth rug, deliberately positioning himself lower than her chair. He maintained a calculated, highly respectful physical distance, waiting patiently for the new environment to feel normal. A few feet away, Pip Vance sat cross-legged on the woven fabric. The heavy, protective layer of daily soot was gone from the 6-year-old's skin. The sharp scent of the foul masking agent had been scrubbed away, replaced by the mild fragrance of ordinary lavender soap. Without the grime, the pale, sharp cheekbones he had inherited directly from the man sitting opposite him were clear. Pip held a massive, intricate silver pocket watch in his small hands. He did not look at the royal heirloom with the reverence of a pack heir. He examined it with the deep, pragmatic suspicion of a Blackport street child. Pip turned the heavy casing over, inspecting the hinges. He tapped the thick glass face twice with his thumbnail to check for hollow spaces. Then, with absolute solemnity, the boy brought the antique watch to his mouth and bit down hard on the silver rim. Clara's breath caught out of deeply ingrained habit, her knuckles whitening instantly as her hand tightened on the wooden armrest. She prepared for the inevitable reprimand. Alistair did not flinch. He simply watched the boy test the expensive metal for lead impurities. A low, quiet laugh rumbled deep in the sovereign's chest. It was a grounding sound, a sound carrying none of the intimidating weight of the northern court, but rather the exhausted relief of a father watching his son apply practical urban survival skills. "It is real solid silver," Alistair said softly, keeping his hands resting loosely on his knees. "You will not need to pawn it to buy bread, though it is good that you know how to check." Pip lowered the watch, Wiping a small smudge of saliva from the engraved casing, he nodded. Slowly, satisfied with his strict metallurgical assessment, and clicked the latch open to watch the brass gears spin. Clara let her rigid grip on the chair loosen, millimetre by millimetre. She leaned back against the deep cushions, feeling the reliable heat of the fire warm the leather of her boots. The burning cedar cracked, shedding a warm golden light over the carriage ledger, the memory of her forged registry papers, and the quiet, immensely powerful man who had learned how to wait for permission. She did not have to prepare the tar and vinegar mixture tonight. She did not have to pack a canvas survival bag before dawn. The contract she had signed guaranteed her independence. It guaranteed her safety on her own terms. And for the first time in 6 long years, the profound silence stretching across the room was not a kind of armor. It was just peace.